When she was 9, her father pulled a mat of dried rushes from a wall in their house in Telemark and held it flat between two pine boards. The room smelled of sheep lanolin and cold pine sap. He pressed his palm to one board, then the other, and made her do the same. One side was warm, one side was cold. The rushes between them had stopped the heat from traveling. Air is warmer than wood, he said, when it cannot move. She filed the lesson the way children file things adults say, without understanding, without forgetting. 49 years later, standing in a shack with frost growing on the inside walls, she needed that lesson to keep her alive. The shack measured 12 feet by 14. Marit Brecke stood inside it on the second morning of October, 1887, and listened to frost tick against the window glass like fingernails tapping from outside. The sound had started before dawn. By the time pale light reached the floor, a skin of ice had formed on the water bucket near the door, and her breath hung in the air 2 feet from her mouth before it vanished. She was 58 years old. She had been a widow for 19 days. Peter Brecke had died on the 14th of September after a threshing accident drove a wooden tine through the meat of his forearm. The wound had not seemed mortal. He had wrapped it himself with a strip of flour sack and gone back to work the next morning. By the third day, the arm was swollen to the elbow, red lines climbing toward the shoulder like rivers drawn on a fever map. By the fifth day, he could not stand. By the ninth day, his breathing had turned to a sound Marit would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. A wet, shallow pulling, like a man trying to drink air through cloth. The burial cost everything. The pine boards came from Judd Rourke's store in Huron, 12 miles east, at prices Rourke set himself. The labor came from 2 neighbors who dug the frozen topsoil with mattocks and did not stay for the meal Marit could not afford to cook. The preacher came from the Methodist circuit and left before the dirt was level. By the time Marit walked back from the grave to the shack, she had $9.70, a debt of $11.25 on Rourke's books, and a winter bearing down on her like a freight train with no whistle. She could not leave. The claim was filed under Pater's name, 160 acres along the James River in Beetle County, Dakota Territory, but the final proof was 2 years away. If she abandoned the land, she lost the improvements, the cow, the 4 hens, the seed wheat, the shack itself, and the only legal path she would ever have to owning ground. A widow could hold a homestead claim. She knew that. Every woman on the prairie knew that. But holding it meant living on it through a winter that had already started baring its teeth in October. The shack had been built for summer filing, not winter survival. The walls were single-board pine, the kind a man could push a knife blade through at the seams. The roof was tar paper over rough planks, and where the planks had warped in the August heat, gaps showed sky. The floor was packed dirt, with a plank walkway from the door to the stove. The stove itself was a cast-iron box with a cracked hinge on the feed door that let sparks spit sideways when the wind came from the north. There was no banking around the foundation. There was no sodded windbreak. There was no second room. Marit owned 1 cow, 4 hens, 31 pounds of flour, 12 pounds of beans, 2 sacks of seed wheat she could not eat without destroying next year's crop, a rifle with 9 cartridges, and less than 1 cord of split wood stacked against the south wall. The wood would last 2 weeks if she burned carefully. After that, she had nothing. The knock came on the 3rd morning. Torsten Kvama arrived without announcement, the way men of authority moved on the prairie, as if their presence were a favor that required no invitation. He was 63, thick through the chest, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he had spent 30 years cutting. He had run timber camps in Wisconsin before coming to Dakota. He had overseen road crews. He sat on the township road board. When Torsten Kvama told a man something about winter, the man listened or the man froze. He did not greet Marit. He walked past her into the shack, knocked his knuckle against the north wall, and watched the board flex inward. "Thin as a cracker box," he said. He crouched and ran his fingers along the sill. Wind came through the gap where the frame met the packed earth. Not a draft, but a steady push, visible in the dust it moved. Wind under the sill. You feel that? Marit felt it. She had felt it for 3 nights. Torsten stood and examined the stove. He opened the cracked door, studied the hinge, closed it, and watched a curl of smoke escape from the wrong side. He looked at the woodpile through the window. He looked at the roof seams. He looked at the north wall again, where frost had already left a dark stain at the corner like a bruise spreading. "You need 6 cords," he said. "Maybe 7 if January comes the way it came in '83. You have less than 1. You have no banking, no sod wall, no windbreak, and a stove door that will set this place on fire before Christmas if you push it hard." He turned to face her. A woman alone cannot beat a Dakota winter with string and wishes. Marit did not answer. She watched his boot prints melt on the floor, dark wet marks where each step had tracked in frost, and thought, every wet mark is another place the cold enters. Torsten waited for her to speak. When she did not, he pulled his collar up and walked to the door. "Sell the cow. Pay what you owe Rourke. Take the stage to Huron and find work until spring. Come back when you have a husband or a hired man." He said it the way he said everything, as instruction, not cruelty. He believed he was helping. The door closed. The frost ticking resumed. Marit sat on the edge of the bed and counted. 6 cords of wood meant 48 cubic feet per cord, 288 cubic feet total. To cut that much wood from the river bottoms meant felling, splitting, and hauling timber that grew on land claimed by men with ox teams and hired hands. She had no team. She had no hired hand. She had a corn knife and a buck saw with 3 teeth missing. Coal was the alternative, and coal was Judd Rourke. Rourke hauled coal from the rail depot in Huron to every homestead within 15 miles, and he set the price himself because no one else owned a freight wagon heavy enough for the loads. A ton of coal cost $14 delivered. Marit had $9.70 and owed Rourke $11.25 already. She would need to hand him every coin she had, and she would still be short, and she would still owe the original debt, and she would have no money left for flour when the beans ran out in December. Twisted hay could burn. She had seen neighbors twist prairie grass into tight knots and feed them to stoves like slow, smoldering cigarettes. But hay burned fast, threw sparks, and demanded constant feeding. With a cracked stove door, 1 spark in the wrong direction would land on the plank floor or the bed tick, and the shack would go up in minutes. She had watched a hay fire take a bachelor's cabin the previous March. The man survived. The cabin did not. Sod walls would insulate, but cutting sod required a breaking plow, a team, and unfrozen ground. The ground was already crusting. She had no plow. She had no team. Every conventional solution required money, muscle, or time she did not have. Torsten was right about the math. He was right about the stove. He was right about the winter. The only thing he was wrong about was the conclusion, because Marit Brecka could not leave. She owed Rourke. She had no relatives in Huron. She had no money for a stage ticket east. She had Pater's claim, Pater's cow, Pater's shack, and a winter that was going to test every board and seam. She would have to find something that was not wood, not coal, not hay, and not sod. Something no one else wanted. Something she could carry alone. She did not know yet what it was. But that evening, feeding the last dry stalks into the stove, She watched a sunflower stem roll off the pile and come to rest under the table, and she left it there. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as failure. For 5 days after Torsten's visit, Marit tried everything she could carry. She stuffed rags into the worst wall cracks. She hung a quilt over the window. She banked the sill with a mix of manure and soil scraped from behind the cowshed. Each morning she checked the north wall. Each morning the frost stain had grown. The temperature had not yet dropped below 10 above zero, and already the wall was sweating cold. On the 6th day, she knelt to sweep the floor, and her knee landed on the sunflower stalk she had left under the table. It broke beneath her weight with a sound she did not expect, not the snap of dry wood or the crackle of straw, but a soft, papery pop, like crushing an empty wasp nest. She picked up the two halves. The outer bark was stiff and fibrous. The inside was white, not hollow like a reed, and not solid like wood. It was something between a pale spongy substance, lighter than anything she had held that was not cloth. She pressed her thumb into it. It compressed and sprang back. She slid the broken piece inside her mitten and forgot about it. 20 minutes later, pulling the mitten off to grip the stove handle, she felt warmth against her palm. Not stove warmth, the warmth of a thing that had been holding heat since she put it there. Quiet, steady heat that had not escaped through the wool. Marit sat down on the bed and held the piece of sunflower pith in both hands. She turned it over. She pressed it. She pulled a strand of it apart and looked at the tiny cells inside, each one like a room with walls too small to see. And then she remembered her father. She was 9 years old, standing in the doorway of their house in Telemark. Her father, Arn, had pulled a mat of dried rushes from the wall cavity and held it flat between two pine boards. He pressed his palm to the outer board and waited. Then he pressed his palm to the inner board. "Feel," he said. Marit felt. The inner board was warm. The outer board was cold. The rushes between them had stopped the heat from traveling. "Air's warmer than wood when it cannot move," Arna said. He tapped the rush mat. "Every reed is a room. Every room holds still air. Still air does not carry cold." Marit had filed that memory the way children file things adults say, without understanding, without forgetting. It had lived in her mind for 49 years, doing nothing. Now, holding a piece of sunflower pith in a freezing shack in Dakota Territory, the memory unlocked. She cut the stalk lengthwise with her belt knife. The white center split clean, and she could see the structure. Hundreds of tiny compartments, each one sealed, each one holding a pocket of air that had no way to move. The substance was dry. It was light. A full stalk weighed almost nothing, and there were thousands of them standing dead in a field 2 miles south. The field belonged to no one now. A German-Russian family named Pfeffer had planted an experimental sunflower patch on a quarter section they abandoned after grasshoppers stripped the crop and an early frost killed what remained. They had gone back to Yankton in August. The stalk still stood, roughly 1/3 of an acre, 6 to 8 feet tall, their black heads hanging like spent torches. Every neighbor who passed that field saw waste, dead weeds, failed ambition, not worth the labor of clearing. Marit saw walls. She did the math on the back of a flour sack with a charcoal nub. The shack perimeter was 52 feet. The walls stood 6.5 feet. Minus the door opening and the window, she needed roughly 500 square feet of coverage. Walls plus ceiling strips plus gable ends. If she built panels 6 inches thick, compressed between willow slats, and tied every 8 inches with twine, she could fill the interior from floor to ceiling. 500 pounds of dry stalks, give or take, carried in bundles of 20 pounds each, 25 trips minimum. She stared at the numbers. 25 trips, 2 miles each way, carrying bundles that would fight the wind like sails, alone, before deep cold. She heard Torsten's voice in her head, string and wishes. She started the next morning. Alma Satter found her at the field on the second day. Alma was 41, the wife of a wheat farmer whose team was working a drainage ditch 10 miles north. She had 3 children, a house better banked than Marit's, but not by much, and exactly enough fuel to get through February if nothing went wrong. She carried exhaustion the way prairie women carried it, in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the flat efficiency of every movement. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. She stopped her mule at the edge of the dead sunflower patch and watched Marit cut stalks with a corn knife, stack them crosswise on a canvas drag, and tie the bundle with strips of old feed sack. "What are you doing?" Alma asked. "Cutting stalks." "For fuel?" "For walls." Alma climbed down from the sled. She walked to the nearest cut bundle and lifted it. It weighed almost nothing. She looked at Marit, then at the shack barely visible 2 miles north, then back at the bundle. "If it will burn, burn it," Alma said. "If it will feed stock, feed it. But walls? Marit, walls are not made from dead flowers." "These are not flowers. They are air." Alma shook her head. "They are kindling. Mice will nest in them before Thanksgiving. Moisture will rot them before Christmas. And one spark from that stove of yours, one spark, Marit, and you are not a widow anymore. You are a fire." She was not wrong. Every concern she raised was legitimate. Sunflower stalks were flammable. They would attract mice. Moisture would destroy them. And Marit's stove threw sparks through the cracked door like a man flicking seeds. But Marit had done a different calculation. If she burned the stalks, she gained perhaps 2 weeks of fuel. 2 weeks in a winter that lasted 5 months. After that, she had nothing again. No fuel, no insulation, no chance. But if the stalks could stop heat from leaving the shack, she could burn less wood all winter. Not 2 weeks of heat, 5 months of less heat lost. The gamble was not, will the stalks burn well? The gamble was, will saving heat matter more than making heat? "I cannot buy coal," Marit said. "I cannot cut 6 cords alone. I can carry dead stalks." Alma stared at her for a long moment. Then she climbed back onto the sled, clicked her tongue at the mule, and drove away. At the fence line, she stopped, pulled a tangled length of old baling twine from under the seat, and hung it on the post without looking back. Marit collected the twine after Alma disappeared over the rise. She added it to the strip of feed sack in her coat pocket. She did not call it charity. She called it twine. Then she cut another row of stalks and pulled the drag north. Word of Marit's project reached Huron before the first panel was built. Judd Rourke heard about it on a Tuesday, standing behind his store counter in town, sorting coal orders into a ledger he kept locked in a drawer. He was 48, thick-faced, with the specific kind of confidence that comes from being the only man in a territory who controls something everyone needs. He hauled coal. He extended credit. He bought distressed claims from widows and bachelors who could not survive the winter, then held the land until prices improved. He was not evil in the way of storybook villains. He was practical in the way that strips the word of all kindness. He listened to 2 freighters laugh about the Breccia widow hauling dead weeds uphill, and he stopped writing in his ledger. He did not laugh. He calculated. If Marit Breccia survived the winter without coal, she kept the claim. If she kept the claim, she owed him $11.25, which she might pay over time, but which would never include interest, because women like Marit Breccia paid debts in eggs and mending and small, miserable coins that took years to accumulate. But if she failed, if the winter drove her out or the shack burned, he could buy the improvements at a sheriff's sale for less than the debt. 160 acres on the James River, already broken, already filed, worth 10 times what he would pay. He had seen this arithmetic before. He had profited from it 4 times in 3 years. On Thursday, Rourke rode to Marit's shack. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked to where she was laying cut sunflower stalks across 2 boards to dry. He did not remove his hat. "Marit," he said, "let us settle matters decent." She stood up, the corn knife still in her hand. "I will take the cow," he said. "Forgive half the account. You leave before Christmas and start fresh in Huron. Plenty of seamstress work, plenty of wash work. No shame in admitting prairie land was meant for men with teams." He said it the way a banker says, "The terms are generous." He expected gratitude. "Then why do you want mine?" Marit said. Rourke's expression changed. Not anger, surprise, the kind of surprise a man shows when a piece on a board moves in a direction he had not considered. His jaw worked once, like he was chewing something he could not swallow. "I'm offering help," he said. "You are offering to buy a dead man's land from his widow for the price of half a grocery bill." Rourke looked at the sunflower stalks drying on the boards. He looked at the shack with its patched window and frost-stained walls. He looked at Marit, who weighed perhaps 115 pounds and was holding a corn knife with blistered hands. "You will freeze," he said, "and when you do, the county will sell everything at auction. I am saving you the humiliation." He mounted his horse and rode back toward the road. Before he reached it, he turned in the saddle and added, loud enough for the wind to carry, "No more twine on credit. If you want supplies, settle the account first." Marit watched him ride until the horse was a dark shape against the flat sky. Then she went back to the sunflower stalks and kept cutting. But Rourke was not finished. Over the following days, word spread through the territory that Rourke had warned his customers. Anyone who helped the Brecka widow might not receive their coal delivery before New Year. He claimed he could not haul for people who waste good labor on weeds. It was a lie. He could haul for whoever he wanted, but it was a lie with teeth, because no one on the prairie was willing to risk their coal order in November for the sake of a woman stuffing weeds into her walls. Children chanted "Flower House" near the well when Marit came to draw water. Someone left a charred sunflower head on her doorstep, the seeds pecked clean by birds, the stem broken at a sharp angle like a neck. 2 men stopped their wagon on the road to watch her drag a loaded canvas across the frozen ruts, and she could hear them laughing before the wind swallowed the sound. Marit unraveled old feed sacks for binding strips. She cut lengths from Pater's worn work shirts, the plaid so faded the pattern had become a ghost of itself. She bartered 2 hours of shirt mending for a neighbor's wife in exchange for a handful of twine scraps and a dull willow branch thick enough to split into slats. Every material she needed, she begged, traded or pulled from the body of her old life. And then she began to build. The first panel took 4 hours. She laid 12 stalks on the floor of the shack, alternating thick ends and thin ends so no ridge bulged along the surface. She placed 2 willow slats lengthwise, one on each side, and pressed them together with her knees while she tied the bundle every 8 inches with the twine and cloth strips she had gathered. When she stood it against the wall, it reached from floor to ceiling, 6.5 feet tall, roughly 2 feet wide, 6 inches thick. She pressed her hand to it. The stalks gave slightly under her palm, then held. She leaned her weight against it. It flexed, but did not collapse. She stood back and looked at the panel the way a woman looks at the first row of stitches in a quilt she's not sure she can finish. It was ugly. It was rough. The twine was uneven, and the stalks poked through at angles. But when she pressed her palm flat against it and held it there, she felt something she had not felt against the bare pine wall, her own warmth returning. The shack needed 56 full panels and 12 narrow filler panels for the gaps around the door frame, the window edges, and the gable triangles above the wall line. She counted the hours. 4 hours per panel meant 224 hours for the full set. If she worked 12 hours a day, cutting, hauling, drying, building, she could finish in 19 days. But she could not work 12 hours a day because she also had to feed the cow, tend the hens, cook what little food she had, carry water, and sleep enough to keep her hands from shaking. 30 days, maybe 35. The first real cold would arrive in late November. She had 50 days at most. It sounded like enough. It was not. The stalks had to be dry before they could be tied. Wet stalks compressed unevenly, left air pockets along the seams, and would rot inside the wall within weeks. But drying stalks near the stove meant feeding the stove, which meant burning wood, which meant depleting the fuel she was trying to save. And drying stalks outside meant losing them to rain, sleet, or the freezing drizzle that came without warning on the Dakota prairie like a thief testing doors. By the 5th day, Marit had built 4 panels and ruined 2. One she had tied with strips of Pater's shirt that were too thin. The binding snapped when she lifted the panel and the stalks scattered across the floor like pickup sticks. The other she had built from stalks that were still damp at the core. By morning, a dark stain had spread through the pith and the panel smelled like wet paper left in a cellar. Her hands were blistered at the base of each finger. The corn knife had raised a callus on her right palm that split and bled every time the temperature dropped below freezing. Her wrist ached from the repetitive cutting motion, 12 stalks per panel, 12 cuts per stalk to trim the branches and seed heads, 144 cuts per panel, and she had built 4 panels in 5 days with 64 still to go. She had not slept more than 5 hours on any night since she started. She ate beans and flour biscuits. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. When she caught her reflection in the water bucket, she saw a woman who looked 10 years older than the one who had buried her husband 19 days ago, and winter was still 6 weeks away. On the 6th morning, she loaded a drag sled with fresh cut bundles and started north from the sunflower field. Halfway home, the sled runner caught on a frozen rut. She pulled. The runner held. She pulled again, leaning her entire weight against the rope, and felt something in her lower back shift in a way that sent a white flash of pain from her hip to her skull. She sat down on the frozen ground beside the sled. The stalks fanned above her like dead fingers against the gray sky. The wind pushed tears sideways across her temples. She could not stand. She could not pull. She sat and breathed and listened to the prairie silence, which was not silence at all, but the constant low hum of wind moving across 10,000 acres of nothing. That was how Guro Haugland found her. If you have ever been working on something that everyone around you dismissed, building something they could not yet see, tell us about it in the comments. Because what happens next in this story is about to change everything Marit's neighbors thought they knew. Guro was 67, small, bent at the shoulders from decades of work that had shaped her spine the way wind shapes a tree. She lived alone in a low sod house near a coulee 2 miles east, close enough to the road to see travelers, but far enough that no one stopped. She was a midwife. She had delivered 19 babies in Beetle County and lost 2, and the 2 she lost, she carried in her memory the way a soldier carries his dead, named, dated, and never discussed. She had come from Telemark, the same district Marit's father had come from, though they had not known each other in Norway. In Telemark, Guro had thatched roofs and repaired sod walls and built turf roof sheds with her husband before he died of diphtheria in 1871. She knew what dead plant material could do when it was handled correctly. And she knew what it looked like when a woman was building something real, because the hands were always the tell, blistered, cracked, and still gripping. She did not ask Marit if she needed help. She walked to the sled runner, examined where it had caught, kicked the frozen rut with her heel until the ice cracked, and pulled the sled free with a motion that said she had freed heavier things from worse ground. Then she looked at the bundle. She did not touch it at first. She leaned close and studied the way the stalks were tied. She pressed her ear against the side and tapped the face with her knuckle, listening for the sound. Then she straightened and looked at Marit with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but something between recognition. "You tied them like firewood," Guro said. "Walls must be tied like cloth." Marit stared at her. "I am making walls." "I can see that." Guro pulled one stalk from the edge of the bundle and held it up. "You have the butt ends all on one side. When you compress them, the thick ends will push a ridge through the face. Your wall will bulge at every panel." She turned the stalk and placed it back in the opposite direction. "Alternate. Thick, thin, thick, thin. Like weaving. The surface stays flat. The air stays even." She said it the way Marit's father had said things. As fact, not instruction. As if the information existed whether Marit heard it or not, and sharing it was simply what a person did when they knew something useful and saw someone who needed it. "Who are you?" Marit asked. "Guro Haugland. I live in the sod house by the East Coulee." "Why are you helping me?" Guro looked at Marit's hands, the split callus, the blistered fingers, the cracked skin along both wrists. She looked at the sled, loaded with stalks that had been cut cleanly, trimmed of branches, and bundled in measured lengths. She looked at Marit's face, which was hollow-cheeked and wind-burned, but focused in the way that only a person doing deliberate work can be focused. "Because you counted the wall area before you cut the first stalk," Guro said. "I can tell because the bundles are the right height. A fool cuts first and measures after." She picked up one end of the drag rope and looked at Marit. Marit picked up the other. They pulled together, and the sled moved north through the frozen ruts toward a shack that was not ready for winter, but was closer to ready than it had been an hour before. The wind picked up behind them. The temperature was dropping, and the first real snow of the season was 3 days away. Guro returned the next morning before dawn. Marit heard the crunch of frozen grass outside and reached for the rifle before she recognized the silhouette through the window, small, bent, carrying a canvas sack over one shoulder and a length of rope coiled around the other. Guro did not knock. She set the sack on the ground beside the door and waited. When Marit opened the door, Guro was already examining the 4 completed panels leaned against the south wall. She ran her hand along the face of the first one, pressing her fingers into the gaps between stalks. She lifted the edge and checked the binding. She tilted the panel forward and looked at the back, where the willow slats had been tied with strips of Pater's old shirts. "The binding will hold," Guro said. "The compression will not." She set the panel flat on the ground and knelt beside it. From her canvas sack, she pulled 2 things: a short plank and a piece of braided rope with a stick threaded through one end, a crude windlass, the kind used to twist hay into tight fuel bundles. "You are pressing with your knees," Guro said. "A knee gives uneven weight. The stalks bunch at the center and gap at the edges." She laid the plank across the panel, threaded the rope around both slats and the plank, and turned the stick. The rope tightened. The plank pressed down evenly across the full width. The stalks compressed, not crushed, but settled, each one nesting against the next, until the 6-inch thickness became 5.5 inches of uniform density. "Feel the face now," Guro said. Marit pressed her palm to the panel. The surface was flat, no ridges, no gaps wide enough to fit a finger. The stalks held together like the pages of a closed book. A wall must be even, Guro said. Uneven means air moves. Air that moves carries cold. Dead air holds warmth. Your father knew this. Marit looked at her. How do you know what my father knew? Because you are building what he would have built. Telemark women do not invent walls from nothing. They remember. That first morning, Guro taught compression and alignment. They rebuilt the 4 existing panels using the windlass technique, alternating butt and head ends the way Guro had shown on the road. The work went faster with 2, one holding the slats in position while the other turned the windlass. And by noon, they had rebuilt all 4 and started 2 new ones. In the afternoon, Guro taught the second skill. She waited until dusk, when the air inside the shack cooled, and the temperature difference between inside and outside became large enough to move air through every flaw. She lit a tallow candle and held it close to the wall where the first panel had been hung. "Watch the flame," she said. Marit watched. Near the center of the panel, the flame stood straight. At the left edge, where the panel met the bare pine wall, the flame bent sideways. A steady lean, as if something invisible were pushing it. "Mark it," Guro said. Marit marked the spot with charcoal. They moved the candle along every seam, every edge, every junction between panel and wall, panel and floor, panel and ceiling plank. By the time they had circled the room, Marit had 14 charcoal marks, 14 places where winter was already entering. "Do not fight winter everywhere," Guro said. "Find where it enters." It was the kind of knowledge that sounded simple and was not. Every hour Marit had spent stuffing rags into random cracks had been wasted effort because the cold did not come evenly. It came through specific failures. A warped board, a missing chink, a sill gap, a nail hole that had widened over the summer. Guro's candle test turned a general problem into a specific map. The charcoal marks were not decoration. They were targets. On the third morning, Guro taught fire and moisture protection. This was the lesson Almasater's fears demanded, the answer to one spark and you are afire. Guro mixed a thin clay slip from soil dug near the coulee, water, and a handful of wood ash. She painted the mixture across the exposed face of one panel with a rag, covering the outer bark in a thin, rough coat that dried to the color of old plaster. Then she held the clay-coated panel near the stove. Marit watched. The bark behind the clay darkened. It charred at the edges where the clay was thin. But it did not catch. The clay held the heat away from the pith long enough for the bark to smolder rather than flame. Without the clay, a raw stalk face would have been burning in seconds. "Clay does not make it safe," Guro said. "Clay makes it slow. Slow is enough if you are watching." She pointed to the wall behind the stove. 12 inches of bare space. No panel touches stove iron. Here. She pulled a piece of flattened tin from her sack, a rectangle cut from a lard can, tin behind the stove wall, nailed to the boards. Heat hits tin. Tin spreads it. Panel never gets the full force. She had one more rule. The lower edge hangs 1 inch above the floor, not touching. 1 inch of air. She crouched and demonstrated, shimming the bottom of a panel with a stick. Meltwater comes under the door. Snow falls off boots. Water reaches the floor and wicks upward through stalk like lamp oil through a wick. 1 inch of air breaks the path. The panel stays dry. 3 skills taught through action: compression for even insulation, candle testing for targeted sealing, and clay and tin protection for fire and moisture. Each one answered a specific doubt that Marit's skeptics had raised, and each one came from Guro's hands, not her mouth, demonstrated, not lectured. Marit asked how Guro knew these things. I thatched in telemark, Guro said. Thatch is grass on a roof. Your father's rushes were grass in a wall. This, she touched the sunflower panel, is the same argument in a different language. Keep air still, keep water out, keep fire respectful. They worked together for the next 18 days. The rhythm was brutal. Each morning before light, Marit walked 2 miles south to the dead sunflower field and cut stalks until her wrist burned. She loaded the drag sled with 20-pound bundles and hauled them back to the shack. After noon, Guro arrived, and they built panels, laying stalks, compressing with the windlass, tying every 8 inches, trimming edges, and stacking the finished panels against the wall to dry near the stove. Progress markers told the story in numbers. By November 10th, they had 14 panels hung and 12 drying. By November 16th, 22 panels were up and the north wall was half covered. By November 22nd, 28 panels lined the north and part of the west wall, and for the first time Marit noticed that the frost stain on the north wall had stopped spreading. But the numbers also told the cost. Marit had lost weight she could see in the way Pater's old coat hung on her shoulders. The same coat that had been loose before now looked draped on a fence post. Her hands bled at the knuckle joints every morning until the cold froze the blood into dark crusts she peeled off like bark. She ate 1 meal a day, beans and biscuit, because the flour was dropping faster than the calendar pages, and she needed the seed wheat untouched for spring. Guro's cough started in the 3rd week, small at first, a dry clearing of the throat after climbing the hill to Marit's shack, then deeper, coming in fits that bent her over the windlass rope. Marit said nothing about it. Guro said nothing about it. They both heard it. On November 25th, the thaw wind came from the southwest. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in 2 weeks, and the air turned heavy and wet. By evening, freezing drizzle fell. Not rain and not snow, but something between, a fine mist that coated everything it touched in a skin of clear ice. 12 panels were drying outside, leaned against the south wall. Marit realized the danger too late. She ran out in the dark with a canvas tarp, but the drizzle had already glazed the panels. Ice had crept into the stalk ends, swelled the pith, and frozen the outer bark into rigid boards. She tried to flex one. It cracked along the binding. She tried another. The ice had fused the twine to the stalks, and pulling the twine tore the bark away in strips. She stood in the drizzle with 12 ruined panels at her feet and did not cry. She counted. 12 panels lost meant 48 hours of work destroyed. She had built 28 good panels and now needed 40 more, not 28 fewer, because the 12 replacements were added to the 12 she had not yet started. 40 panels in 20 days, with the weather turning hostile and her body thinning by the week. She cried once behind the cowshed where the sound would not carry. Then she went inside and started cutting the ruined outer bark away from the panels with her belt knife. By morning, she had salvaged 6 sabots, half panels, scarred and uneven, but dry at the core where the ice had not penetrated. Good enough for the gable ends where the fit did not have to be perfect. Guro arrived and saw the ruined panels without asking what had happened. She helped Marit sort the salvageable stalks and said only, "Now you know what the drizzle does. Dry everything under cover from now on. No exceptions." The work continued. December 1st, 41 panels up. December 5th, the west wall was fully covered and the ceiling strips were started. December 9th, north and west walls complete. East wall 2/3 done. On that day, Torsten Kvame rode past on the road, slowed his horse, and looked at the shack through the window where the quilt had been replaced by a sunflower shutter. He did not stop, but he looked, and Marit, watching from inside, saw him look. December 15th. Only the ceiling strips and 3 narrow filler panels remained. Marit hung the last full wall panel on the east side, behind the bed, and stood back. The interior of the shack had been transformed. The pine walls were gone, hidden behind pale, ribbed surfaces that smelled faintly of dry grass and clay. Willow battens ran vertically every 2 feet. Twine knots studded the surface like stitches on a wound. The clay wash gave the panels a rough, plastered look. Not beautiful, not even neat, but solid. Present. The walls looked like they meant to stay. That evening, Marit burned 1 small armload of wood. The stove put out its usual heat. But something was different. The heat did not vanish. It pooled in the center of the room and stayed there, like water finding a bowl. An hour after the last flame died to coals, the air near the stove still held warmth. The north wall, which had been a slab of cold every night since October, was cool to the touch, but not frozen. The frost stain was gone. She pressed her palm to the panel the way her father had pressed his palm to the board over the rushes. Warmth came back against her skin. Her own warmth returned. She had not proven anything yet. Not to Torsten, not to Alma, not to Rourke, not to the freighters who had laughed. A mild December night was not a test. A real test required the kind of cold that killed cattle standing in fields, the kind that turned breath to ice before it left the mouth, the kind that made a pine board crack like a rifle shot at 3 in the morning. That cold was coming. Every sign on the prairie said so. By Christmas week, the panels were complete. Every wall was covered. The ceiling strips ran between the rafters in rows. The gable ends were packed with the half panels salvaged from the ice storm. The door had a sunflower mat hung on a nail that Marit lowered at night like a tapestry. The window had a 2-inch shutter made of stalks stitched between feed sack cloth, removable for daylight. Guro brought 2 thermometers. She had borrowed them from a school teacher in Huron who used them for science lessons and would not miss them until January. She nailed 1 beside the stove and 1 to the north wall, 6 feet from the heat source. On Christmas morning, the outside temperature sat at 6 below zero. The stove had been banked low overnight, 3 sticks of split wood, and a damper closed to a slit. The thermometer beside the stove read 48 degrees. The thermometer on the north wall read 39. Before the panels, at similar temperatures, water froze in the wash basin by morning. The basin now held liquid water with a thin skim of ice near the door, the one spot where the draft still entered under the threshold. Marit showed the readings to Guro. Guro nodded but did not celebrate. "Mild cold," she said. "The real question is whether these walls hold when the air tries to kill you." Torsten saw the thermometers when he came by 2 days later, not to visit, but to check whether the road past Marit's shack was passable after a drift. He stood in the doorway and looked at the transformed interior. He did not enter. "Mild weather proves nothing," he said. Alma sent Clara with a jar of pickled beets and a question. "Ma wants to know what happens when the mice find it." Marit showed Clara the clay-washed faces of the panels and the 1-inch gap at the floor. She pointed to a strip of tin nailed along the baseboard where the panel met the dirt. No mouse could chew through tin to reach the stalks. Clara looked at the walls with wide eyes, touched one panel with her fingertip, and said, "It is warm." "Tell your mother," Marit said. Rourke heard about the thermometers from a freighter who had stopped for water at Marit's well. He did not visit, but within 3 days word came back through the territory that Rourke was telling customers the Brecca shack would burn like a haystack with a chimney through it. He said it with the specific confidence of a man who benefits from fear, because every household that doubted Marit's panels would buy another delivery of coal, and every delivery enriched Rourke by $3 above his cost. The atmosphere on the prairie changed in the first week of January. Freight teams arrived in Huron with frost-burned muzzles on the horses and ice caked in the harness rings. Telegraph poles along the road wore coats of clear ice from a freezing fog that had rolled through overnight. Cattle refused the north pasture. Old men who had survived the winter of '83 sat near store stoves and said the air tasted the same, metallic, heavy, still. The kind of stillness that precedes violence. Guro felt the pressure in her joints. She had said so before, that her knees and wrists told the weather 2 days ahead of the sky, and Marit had learned not to dismiss it. On January 9th, Guro walked the inside of the shack one more time, checking every panel. Near the door, on the east wall, she found dampness. A panel had absorbed moisture from the threshold draft, the one gap Marit had not fully sealed. Guro did not reassure her. She made Marit pull the panel down immediately. Behind it, the pine wall was dark with condensation, and in the lower corner, wedged between the stalk butts, a mouse had started a nest, shredded grass, 2 seed holes, and a scrap of cloth. "One weakness is enough for winter to enter," Guro said. She was not talking about the mouse. They rebuilt the panel that afternoon. Guro sealed the threshold gap with a clay strip pressed into the crack, then laid a piece of tin over the clay and nailed it at 4 points. They compressed a fresh panel with tighter battens and hung it with a 2-inch gap at the bottom instead of 1 inch. Extra clearance for the spot most likely to collect meltwater. The work took 3 hours. It was the last thing Guro built in Marit's shack. On the morning of January 11th, 1888, the air over the James River Valley was warm. Not spring warm, not even mild, but warmer than it had been, a cruel warmth, the kind that comes when a massive weather system pushes heated air ahead of itself, like a wave pushing driftwood before the surge. The thermometer outside Merritt's shack read 34 degrees at dawn. Ice dripped from the eaves. Puddles formed in the wagon ruts for the first time in weeks. Men went to town without full wraps. Women opened doors to let the stale air out. Children walked to the schoolhouse in Huron without scarves. The warmth felt like a gift after weeks of bitter cold. It was not a gift. It was bait. Marit did not trust it. She had seen the stove draft reverse twice that morning, smoke pushing back into the room instead of drawing up the pipe, which meant the air pressure outside was falling faster than the stove could compensate. A falling barometer ahead of warmth meant something was pushing the warmth forward, something cold behind it. Guro arrived at mid-morning to inspect the rebuilt panel near the door. She moved slowly. Her cough had worsened over the past week, and the climb to Merritt's shack left her winded in a way that Marit noticed but did not mention. Guro pressed her hand to the east wall and felt the panel, dry, firm clay coat intact. "Bank the door before noon," Guro said. "The temperature is above freezing. My knees say it is lying." By noon, the sky had changed. The pale blue that had opened over the prairie was gone, replaced by a flat gray that moved from the northwest like a lid closing. The dripping from the eaves stopped. The puddles in the ruts began to skim with new ice. And then the rain started. Not water rain, but something colder. Something that hit the window glass with a ticking sound Marit recognized from October. Freezing rain, the kind that coated everything it touched in a shell of clear ice. Within an hour, the pump handle was glaze solid. The fence wire was sheathed in ice a 1/4 inch thick. The wagon spokes in the yard glittered like glass. Each blade of grass wore its own transparent coffin. Then the wind arrived. It came from the northwest with a sound that was not a howl and not a roar, but something lower. a sustained pressure, like the prairie itself leaning on the shack. The temperature dropped as the wind came. 34 degrees became 20 in less than an hour. 20 became 10. 10 became 0. The ice on every surface locked down. Nothing dripped. Nothing moved. The world became a glazed, frozen still life with wind as its only animation. Marit wired the stove door shut with a nail and the stove lifter. The cracked hinge had been failing all winter, and now, with the stove pushed hard to fight the dropping temperature, the door swung open every time the draft surged. Sparks spat sideways toward the south wall, toward the panels Marit had spent 2 months building. She wrapped wire around the hinge 3 times, twisted it tight with the lifter handle, and watched the door hold. It held. But every gust of wind pushed smoke and spark light through the gap where the wire did not fully close, and Marit knew she would not sleep tonight. By mid-afternoon, visibility collapsed. The snow came not from the sky, but from the ground, wind-driven, horizontal, scouring across the ice layer like sand. The window became white. The sound on the walls changed from ticking to a steady rasp, as if something with claws were dragging itself around the perimeter. Inside, Guro sat by the stove and said nothing. Marit fed 2 split sticks into the firebox. Not the armload she would have needed in an uninsulated shack, but 2 sticks, each the thickness of her wrist, laid across the coals and left to catch. She closed the wired door. She closed the damper to a slit. The stove did not roar. It muttered, a low, steady burn that sent heat into the room the way a heartbeat sends blood, not in a rush, but in a rhythm. And the room held it. The north wall thermometer read 58 degrees. Outside, the temperature had fallen below 0 and was still dropping. The difference between inside and outside was more than 60 degrees, and the stove was burning 2 sticks. In Torsten Kavama's house, a quarter-mile east, the situation was different. Torsten had built well, sod-banked walls, double-board construction, a good stove with a sound door. But his house had no insulation beyond the sod banking, and the wind found every seam the way Guro's candle had found every flaw. His stove consumed wood fast. He had plenty stacked. Torsten was not a man who ran short, but the draw was fierce, and the heat vanished upward and outward almost as fast as he could make it. His wife Eli pulled a second quilt from the chest and wrapped it around her shoulders. The inside of their north window was coated in frost thick enough to scrape with a fingernail. In Alma Satter's house, a half-mile south, the stovepipe draft reversed. The same pressure drop that had pushed Marit's stove smoke backward now filled Alma's kitchen with a gray haze that made the children cough. Alma stuffed a wet rag around the pipe joint and opened the firebox to let the smoke draw from below. It helped. Then her youngest, Peter, started coughing in a way that was not smoke, a deep barking cough that came from the chest, each bark followed by a wheezing intake that sounded like air being pulled through a wet reed. Peter was 6 years old and had been fighting a cold for a week. The cold air, the smoke, and the dropping pressure had turned a nuisance into something Alma could hear across the room. She held him on her lap and listened to his breathing and thought about Marit's shack, where Clara had said the walls were warm. In Rourke's storehouse at the edge of Huron, the stove that heated the back room cracked along an old seam. He had overfired it, packed the box with coal, and opened the damper full to fight the wind roaring down the chimney. And the iron, stressed by years of use and the sudden temperature swing, split from the fire door to the ash pan. Smoke poured through the crack. He closed the damper and let the fire die, then sat in his coat in the darkening room and felt the cold come through the walls the way it came through every wall on the prairie, fast, steady, and utterly indifferent to what he had paid for the coal. The hours passed like stones dropped into a well. Each one fell, and the dark grew deeper. At 6 in the evening, Marit read the thermometers. Stove side, 63 degrees. North wall, 51. She had burned 4 sticks of wood since noon, 4 sticks. In a normal shack in a normal storm, she would have burned half a cord by now and still been cold. The panels were not making heat. They were stopping its escape. The room was a vessel, and the heat stayed inside it the way water stays in a sealed jar. Guro sat in the chair beside the stove, her hands folded in her lap, her cough quiet for the first time in days. The warmth agreed with her lungs. She had not spoken in an hour, and Marit did not interrupt her silence. At 8 o'clock, someone pounded on the door. Marit opened it against the wind. Alma Satter stood in the dark, with Peter wrapped in a quilt, his face pressed against her neck, each breath the whistle that Marit could hear over the storm. Alma's hair was glazed with ice. Her boots were coated. Her eyes were wild in the way that only a mother's eyes can be wild. Not panic, but something harder, a calculation of risk that had already been made. "His breathing," Alma said. That was all she said. Between Alma and the door, a drift of ice-crusted snow had built against the shack wall. Alma had crossed it carrying Peter, and the effort had left her gasping. The glaze on the ground made every step a negotiation between boot and ice. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because the next 12 hours inside this shack are about to change the way an entire community understands survival. Marit pulled them inside. Peter's face was red and hot despite the cold. His cough had deepened into something that rattled in his chest like a stone in a tin cup. Guro took him from Alma without asking, set him on the bed, propped him upright against the wall with Marit's pillow and a rolled blanket, and placed a pot of water on the stove. Steam would help the breathing. Warmth would help the rest. Alma stood in the middle of the room and looked at the walls. She touched one panel, then pulled her hand back as if she had expected cold and found warmth instead. She said nothing. She did not need to. At 9:30, Torsten Kvama arrived. He was half carrying his wife, Eli, whose hands were white at the fingertips. The color that comes before frostbite becomes damage. Their stove was burning well, Torsten said, but the wind had torn a roof seam open, and the north corner of their house was filling with blown snow. He had banked it with a blanket and a board, but the cold coming through the gap was more than the stove could fight. Torsten looked at the sunflower panels on Marit's walls. He looked at the thermometer reading 59 degrees on the north wall while a killing storm screamed outside. He looked at the stove, which was burning low and quiet. He did not say he was wrong. He said, "How much room do you have?" "Enough," Marit said. At 10 o'clock, Judd Rourke appeared. He did not pound on the door. He knocked. A small, almost polite sound that was so different from his usual manner that Marit opened the door expecting a stranger. Rourke's beard was iced solid. His left ear was gray-white at the tip. His hands were shoved inside his coat, and his shoulders were hunched in a way Marit had never seen on a man who carried himself like he owned the ground he walked on. "Come to check on accounts," he said. No one in the room believed him. But Marit stepped aside, and Rourke entered, and the door closed against the storm. 8 people now occupied a room built for one. Marit, Guro, Alma, Peter, Torsten, Eli, Rourke, and the heat of a stove burning 2 sticks at a time. At 11 o'clock, Torsten's hired hand Milo Dace was not among them. Milo slept in a bunk room behind Torsten's barn, a board and tar paper lean-to with a sheet iron stove the size of a bucket. When the roof seam tore, Milo decided to haul more wood from the pile behind the house. He stepped outside, and the wind took his direction. He walked 15 steps in what he believed was the right bearing and found himself at the fence line, 60 feet from the woodpile, facing south instead of west. He turned. The white closed around him. Every direction was identical, screaming white, ice pellets stinging his face, ground so glazed his boots slid with every step. He made it to Torsten's shed by luck. He hit the wall with his shoulder, felt along the boards until he found the door, and collapsed inside on a pile of empty grain sacks. His hands were numb, his feet were numb, his face was raw. He curled into the sacks and pulled them over his body and waited for the storm to pass, or his heart to stop. Torsten found him at dawn. Milo was alive. His fingers on the left hand were frostbitten. 3 of them would blacken over the following weeks, and his right ear would lose its shape and become a knotted lump of scar tissue. But he was alive. 15 steps from the door to the fence line, and the storm had nearly killed him. This was the same storm that killed men in open fields across Dakota Territory, that caught school children walking home, that froze a man standing upright against a fence post with his hand still gripping the top wire. Inside Marit's shack, the night was not comfortable. 8 bodies in a 12 by 14 room meant elbows and knees and the smell of wet wool and unwashed skin. Peter coughed through the dark hours, each bark echoing off the sunflower panels like a drumbeat in a small church. Eli held her hands near the stove, and the color came back slowly. Red first, then painful pink, then the gray-white fading to something that looked like skin again. Rourke sat on the floor near the door with his arms crossed and his hat still on, saying nothing to anyone. But the room was warm. At midnight, Marit added 2 sticks to the stove. The thermometer beside the stove read 67. The thermometer on the north wall read 54. The wind outside sounded like a living thing trying to enter, pressing on every board, testing every seam, and every seam held. The panels flexed slightly in the gusts. Marit could see the willow battens shiver, but the clay coat did not crack, the twine did not snap, and the air inside the wall stayed still. At 3 in the morning, the temperature outside dropped to a point where the thermometer Guro had hung on the fence post would later show its lowest mark, far below 0, colder than anything Marit had experienced in her years on the prairie. The stove was down to coals. Marit had not fed it in 2 hours because she was sitting beside Peter, listening to his breathing, which had eased after midnight. The steam from the pot and the warmth of the room had done what cold air and smoke could not. Loosened the tightness in his chest until the bark became a cough, became a murmur, became the quiet, regular breathing of a child asleep. Marit looked at the north wall. No frost, no ice, no sweating. The panels were doing the only thing she had ever asked them to do: hold still the air between the cold and the warmth, and let the warmth win. At dawn, she added 2 more sticks and opened the damper. The stove caught and the thermometer climbed. 68, 69, 70. Guro read the number and wrote it on the back of Marit's charcoal-marked flour sack, beneath the panel measurements and the wall area calculations. 70 degrees. On a morning when the ice outside was thick enough to hold a man's weight on the water trough, with a stove burning low instead of roaring, in a shack made of cracker box boards and dead sunflower stalks. Torsten was the first to touch the wall. He stood, walked to the north panel, and pressed his palm flat against it. He held it there for a long time. His face showed nothing. Then he pulled his hand away and looked at his palm as if it had told him something he was not ready to hear. The door opened at 7:30. The storm had passed. The world outside was glazed white, every surface coated in ice, so clear and bright that the morning sun turned the prairie into a field of broken mirrors. The wind had stopped. The silence was enormous. Marit stood in the doorway and felt the cold hit her face like a wall. Behind her, the room was warm. In front of her, the prairie was a thing that killed. She had burned less than a third of a cord through the entire crisis. Her woodpile was not empty. Her stove was not cracked. Her walls were standing. 8 people had survived the night in a shack that Torsten Kvamme had called a cracker box. And the thing that saved them was 500 pounds of dead sunflower stalks that every neighbor on the James River had called worthless weeds. No one left the shack immediately. They stood in the doorway or sat on the bed or leaned against the warm walls and looked at the glazed world and breathed. Peter slept. Eli flexed her fingers. Alma stared at the north wall panel as if it owed her an answer to a question she had not yet asked. Rourke pulled his hat lower over his gray ear and stepped outside without speaking. Torsten was the last to leave. At the door, he turned and looked at the room, the pale-ribbed panels, the clay-streaked seams, the willow battens, the twine knots, the 2 thermometers that had measured the difference between Marit's shack and every other house on the prairie. He did not say thank you. He did not say he was wrong. He said, "I will come back tomorrow." The door closed. Marit stood alone in the warm room with Guro, who was coughing softly into her sleeve. Outside, the ice cracked and settled in the silence. The stove ticked as it cooled. The cow lowed from the shed, alive, waiting to be fed. The crisis was over, but something had started that Marit could not yet see. A change that would move outward from the shack like heat through still air, slow, invisible, and impossible to stop. Torsten came back the next afternoon, as he said he would. He brought a hand axe and a question. The axe was for splitting willow slats. The question was for Marit. "How high do you hang the lower edge?" Marit looked at him standing in her doorway, the same doorway he had filled in October when he had told her she could not survive, the same threshold he had crossed in the dark with his frostbitten wife 12 hours ago. He was not a man who apologized. He was a man who learned by doing, and asking how high to hang the lower edge was as close to an apology as Torsten Kvamme would ever come. 1 inch, Marit said, 2 inches near the door. And the clay? Thin coat on the face, wood ash mixed in, thicker near the stove wall. Torsten nodded once and set the hand axe on the table. "Show me the windlass." She showed him. He studied the rope tension, the plank compression, the way the stalks nested when the butt and head ends alternated. He pressed his palm to a finished panel, the same gesture he had made at dawn during the storm, and held it there. "I told you 6 cords," he said. "You told me what a poor wall costs," Marit said. Torsten pulled his hand from the panel. "I counted fuel. You counted loss." He said it quietly, the way a man says something he has been composing in his mind since he walked home across the ice that morning. It was not poetry. It was an accounting correction, the admission that his formula had been wrong because it measured the wrong thing. He did not stay long. He took measurements of the panel dimensions, asked about the twine spacing, and left with the hand axe and a single finished panel tucked under his arm to study at home. At the door, he said, "Eli wants to know if the window shutter pattern is the same. Thinner, 2 inches, stitched between cloth. She will come by." The conversions did not happen as a crowd. They happened as individuals, each arriving alone, each carrying a specific question that revealed what the storm had taught them. Alma came on the 3rd morning after the crisis. She did not bring Peter, who was recovering under quilts at home, his cough reduced to a dry bark that came only at night. She brought a sack of dried beans, 2 pounds, which was not nothing when beans cost 8 cents a pound and winter was half over. She set the beans on the table and said, "Show me the wall." Marit did not gloat. She did not remind Alma of the conversation at the sunflower field. She pulled one panel from its battens and laid it flat on the floor, and she showed Alma everything: the alternating stalk ends, the windlass compression, the 8-inch tie spacing, the clay wash, the tin shield behind the stove, the 1-inch gap at the floor, the charcoal mark draft test. She showed it the way Guro had shown her, as fact, not instruction. Alma asked 3 questions. First, could she use cattail stalks instead of sunflower? Marit said she did not know, but the pith would need to be tested. Sunflower pith held air in sealed cells, and cattail pith might be different. Second, what about the stove wall? Alma's stove sat against the east wall, not the south. Marit said the 12-inch bare zone was measured from the stove iron, not from a compass direction. Wherever the stove stood, the panels stayed back. Third, what happened to the mice? Marit showed her the tin strip along the baseboard and the clay-sealed face. Mice cannot chew tin. Mice do not eat clay. If they get behind the panel, you will hear them before they nest. Pull the panel, clean the wall, and replace. Alma nodded. She picked up the sack of beans, forgetting she had brought them as a gift, and Marit touched her arm and pointed. Alma looked at the beans, looked at Marit, and set them back on the table. "Clara says your walls are warm," Alma said. "Clara is right. I told her not to come here. She came anyway." Alma's jaw tightened. She takes after her father. He does things I tell him not to do as well. It was not affection in her voice exactly. It was recognition, the acknowledgement that stubbornness, the same quality she had criticized in Marit, was the quality that had sent her daughter through the snow with a spool of twine. Over the following week, 5 more people came. A bachelor farmer named Soren Flatten, who lived in a tar paper shack worse than Marit's original condition, asked if he could buy panels. Marit refused his money. She told him to bring a corn knife and help cut for the schoolhouse, and she would teach him the method while they worked. The school teacher, a young woman named Hilda Espeland, who boarded in a room behind the school, asked whether the schoolhouse walls could be lined before the next cold front. Marit walked the school with her and measured the walls. 3 times the area of the shack, with a larger stove and more windows to seal. An elderly bachelor from a claim 4 miles west sent word through Torsten that he wanted the flower wall for his north side. A widow with 2 children under 5, or a woman Marit had seen at the well but never spoken to, appeared at the shack one morning with a flour sack bundle of cut sunflower stalks she had gathered on her own, asking Marit to check whether they were the right kind. They were. Marit showed her where to cut and how to trim. The measurable results spread through the territory as hard numbers, not opinions. Marit's shack had used less than half the wood Torsten had predicted for the coldest week. Her wash basin stopped freezing except beside the door. The north wall stayed above 32 degrees during nights when neighbors had frost on their interior walls. A test scrap, a 6-inch square of raw panel face held near the stove at 4 inches, charred slowly under the clay coat. But when Marit held an exposed stalk end at the same distance, it caught in seconds. This became a rule she taught to everyone. No raw stalk ends within 18 inches of stove iron. Cut them, tuck them, clay them. Never leave a bare end facing the heat. Rourke's initial reaction was not conversion. It was arithmetic. He told 3 customers in the same week that the Breka shack had been warm because 8 bodies sweated it full, not because of sunflower stalks. Body heat, he said. Simple body heat in a small room. The stalks were decorative. The woman was lucky. Guro heard this secondhand from Clara, who heard it from a boy at school, who heard it from his father at Rourke's store. Guro did not argue publicly. She waited until Rourke came to collect a payment from a farmer near the coulee, and she stepped out of her sod house and said, loud enough for the farmer and his wife to hear, "My stove did not crack in the storm. Yours did. Explain that with body heat." Rourke looked at her. He did not have an answer, because the question was not about heat. It was about loss. His stove cracked because he overfired it. He overfired it because his walls could not hold the heat at a lower burn. Marit's stove burned low, and the room stayed warm, which meant the stove was never stressed. The panels had not just saved fuel, they had saved the stove itself. Rourke turned his horse and rode away. The farmer looked at Guro. "Is it true about the sunflower walls?" "Go see for yourself," Guro said. He went. In the weeks after the storm, Marit and Guro built what Guro called the system. Not just panels, but a repeatable method that anyone could follow. They worked in Marit's shed, a lean-to behind the shack where Pedir had stored tools, setting up a station with the windlass, a cutting block, and stacks of raw stalks sorted by diameter. Guro insisted on the sorting. Thin stalks, less than the diameter of a thumb, went to one pile. Medium stalks, thumb to wrist, went to another. Thick stalks, wrist and above, were split lengthwise and used as filler between the thinner pieces. "A wall is not a bundle," Guro said. "A wall is a weave, thick next to thin, butt next to head, tight where the wind comes, loose where it does not. You must think of each panel as a bolt of cloth, not a stack of sticks." The method, laid out in order, cut after frost when the stalks were dry and the pith had hardened. Dry under airflow, propped upright or laid on racks with space between bundles. Never flat on the ground where moisture could wick in. Sort by diameter. Alternate butt and head ends in each panel. Compress with the rope windlass, using a plank for even pressure. Tie every hand span, 8 inches, with twine, cloth strip, or braided grass. Clay wash the exposed face with the ash and soil mixture. Leave a 1-inch gap at the bottom. Shield the stove wall with tin, 12 inches of bare space minimum. Inspect for damp weekly. Pull and replace any panel that showed dark staining or soft spots. They wrote none of it down. Marit could not write in English, and Guro's hands shook too badly to hold a pencil. The method was taught by hands. Guro's hands guiding Marit's, Marit's hands guiding Alma's daughter Clara, Clara's hands guiding the next person who came. It traveled the way knowledge traveled on the frontier, through touch, through demonstration, through the memory of fingers that had done the work. Marit began teaching formally in the second week of February. She did not hoard the method. She remembered Alma carrying Pedir through the ice storm, the look on Alma's face, the sound of Pedir's breathing, the fact that Alma had come to the door she had refused to help build. If more houses had sunflower panels, fewer people would need to knock on Marit's door in the next emergency. The method's value increased the more people used it. But teaching changed the relationship between Marit and Guro. Guro had always been the one who corrected, who adjusted, who knew the next step. Now Marit was correcting others, fixing Torsten's first bundle because he tied it too loose, showing Alma where to place the tin strip behind her stove, catching Soren Flatin's mistake of using green stalks that would shrink and leave gaps. Marit had become the authority, and Guro watched this happen with an expression Marit could not read. One afternoon in late February, they disagreed. Marit wanted to start building panels for the schoolhouse immediately, before the last snow. Guro said no. The schoolhouse walls were plaster over lath, not bare pine. Hanging panels on plaster would trap moisture between the plaster and the stalks, and by spring the plaster would rot, and the school would need new walls. Then we remove the plaster first. Marit said. You cannot remove the plaster from a school without the school board's permission, and the school board is 3 men who think you are still the flower wall widow. They came through my door in the storm. They came through your door because they were freezing. Gratitude does not last as long as cold. Wait until summer. Remove the plaster when the school is empty. Build the panels properly. If you build badly for speed, Rourke will use the failure against you. Marit wanted to argue. She had spent the winter fighting for every panel, every stalk, every knot. The urgency was in her bones. But Guro was right, and Marit knew she was right, because Guro had been right about the stalk alignment and the draft testing and the clay wash and the 1-inch gap and the tin shield and everything else. Being right was Guro's most consistent quality. It was also the most difficult to accept. Summer? Marit said. Summer, Guro said. Then she coughed, and the cough bent her over the windlass, and Marit held her shoulders until it passed. Guro's cough had not improved since the storm. If anything, the effort of the crisis night, the hours in the warm room, the steam, the cold walk home afterward, had settled something deeper into her chest. She moved more slowly in March. She arrived later. She left earlier. One day she did not come at all, and Marit found her in the sod house by the coulee, sitting beside a cold stove with her coat still on, breathing in shallow pulls that sounded like Peter's last week. Light the stove, Guro said. You should come to my house. Light the stove, Marit. Marit lit the stove. She stayed until the room was warm, and then she stayed longer, because leaving felt like letting go of something she was not ready to release. They did not talk about the panels, or the method, or the schoolhouse. They talked about telemark, the way the light came through pine trees in winter, the sound of the river in spring, the name of a baker in Guro's village who made a rye bread so dense it could be used to hammer nails. They laughed about the bread. It was the last time Marit heard Guro laugh. Guro refused a wagon ride to Huron. I have lived long enough to know when help costs more than it gives, she said. The words were not self-pity. They were the same kind of accounting that Guro applied to everything, a clear-eyed measurement of what was available and what was spent. She died in the 3rd week of March, during a thaw that turned the prairie brown and soft. Marit found her in the sod house, in the chair beside the stove, dressed in her coat and hat, as if she had been planning to go somewhere. The stove was cold. The room was cold. Guro's hands were folded in her lap, and on the table beside her was the rope windlass, the one she had brought on the first morning, the one they had used to compress every panel in Marit's shack. Marit carried the windlass back to her own shed and hung it on a nail above the door. She did not use it immediately. She stood beneath it and breathed and let the grief settle into the place where grief lives in a body that has already held too much. The next morning, going through Guro's things to prepare the sod house for the county, Marit found a mitten hanging on a peg beside the door. Inside the mitten, packed to fill the fingers and palm, was sunflower pith, crumbled and dry, stuffed into the wool to absorb moisture and keep the lining from rotting. It was a small thing, a practical thing, the kind of thing Guro would have done without mentioning it, because mentioning it would have meant explaining it, and Guro never explained what she could demonstrate. Marit put the mitten in her coat pocket and wore it for the rest of the spring. The flood came in April. 3 weeks of snowmelt swelled the coulee and the creek beds that fed the James River until water stood in every low spot on the prairie. Marit's shack sat high enough to stay dry, but the road south, the road to the sunflower field, ran through a depression that filled with 2 feet of muddy water. Several families had stacked cut sunflower stalks in bundles along fence lines and beside sheds, drying them for panels they planned to build when the weather warmed. The floodwater found those bundles the way it found everything in its path. The flattened bachelor's stack, 30 bundles leaned against his south fence, soaked from the bottom up. Two-thirds of the stalks turned dark within days, the pith softening to a pulp that smelled like wet grain left in a bin. Alma's reserve stalks, stored in a lean-to with a dirt floor, wicked moisture through the floor and swelled until the bindings popped. A family named Tveit, who lived near the coulee where Guro's sod house had stood, lost everything they had cut, 40 bundles submerged when the coulee overflowed its bank. Marit knew what to do because Guro had already taught her. The glazed panel disaster in November and the damp panel discovery in January had both been moisture lessons. She had lost 12 panels to ice and nearly lost the shack to a mouse nest that started behind a damp wall. Guro's voice was in her memory, clear as the candle flame that had mapped the drafts. Water reaches the floor and wicks upward through stalk like lamp oil through a wick. She walked to every household that had stored stalks and delivered the same instruction. Strip the wet panels immediately. Do not hang them hoping they will dry. Prop the stalks upright, individually with air between them. Let the sun and wind do the work. Any stalk that stayed dark after 3 days of drying was ruined. The pith had collapsed and would not hold air. Throw it out. Better to lose a stalk than to hang a rotten panel that would breed mold against a wall where children slept. Soren Flatten argued. He had spent 2 weeks cutting those stalks, and throwing away 2/3 of them meant starting over from nothing. Marit understood his frustration. She had cried behind the cowshed when the ice storm took her panels, but she had also seen what happened when the Tveit family, ignoring her warning, hung their damp panels anyway, hoping the heat from the stove would dry them from the inside. Within 10 days, the Tveit panels darkened. Within 2 weeks, a gray-green mold appeared along the lower edges. Within 3 weeks, the mold had spread to the wall behind the panels, and the Tveit children's bed was pushed against that wall. Marit went to the Tveit house uninvited, pulled the panels down in front of the family, showed them the mold, thick, soft, smelling of cellar rot, twine, and scraped the wall clean with a corn knife. "This is what damp does," she said. "Not in a month, not in a season, in 3 weeks. She rebuilt the wall section herself, using dry stalks from her own reserve. She did not lecture. She did not say, "I told you." She worked, and the Tveit family watched, and by the time the new panels were hung, dry, clay-washed, gapped at the floor, the lesson had been delivered the way Guro would have delivered it, through hands. The spring flood became Marit's second crisis, and she faced it without Guro. Every decision she made, strip the wet stalks, inspect for mold, reject anything that stayed dark, rebuild rather than repair, came from Guro's teaching applied to a situation Guro had not lived to see. This was the echo the mentor's arc demanded, the student using the teacher's lessons in a new emergency, alone, with no one to confirm the choice. Rourke saw the flood damage as opportunity. He rode to 3 farms that had lost their sunflower stalks and told the families that the entire method was flawed, that sunflower panels could not survive a wet season, that the winter results had been a fluke, that next winter would prove the stalks worthless. He offered to sell them coal at a rate he called fair and everyone else called steep. But he also did something more dangerous. He began selling what he called Rourke's Prairie Heat Mats, cheap bundles of sunflower stalks tied loosely with raw twine, no clay wash, no stalk sorting, no compression. He sold them for 50 cents each to families too poor or too impatient to learn the full method, and he told them the technique was the same as what the Break a Widow does, only simpler. It was not the same. It was a shortcut built by a man who had never pressed his ear to a bundle never held a candle to a seam, never watched a mouse nest grow behind a damp wall. The bundles were loose, which meant the air inside could move. The twine was raw, which meant it would rot in moisture. The faces were uncoated, which meant a spark could catch. If this story has changed the way you think about preparation, about listening to the person everyone else dismissed, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Marit built is about to face its hardest test yet. The test came in late April. A family named Holst, 4 miles north, had bought 3 of Rourke's mats and hung them behind their kitchen stove. The stove threw a spark through a cracked seam. The same failure that had cracked Rourke's own stove in January. And the spark landed on the uncoated face of a Rourke mat. The stalk ends caught. Smoke filled the kitchen in seconds. The family doused the fire with a bucket of wash water before it spread, but the smoke damage blackened the wall and ceiling, and the smell lingered for weeks. Rourke blamed Marit's method. He told customers at his store that the Holst fire proved sunflower panels were dangerous, that his warnings about haystacks with chimneys had been right all along. Torsten Kvame walked into Rourke's store that afternoon. He had not planned to. He had come for lamp oil, but he heard Rourke telling the story to 2 farmers, and he stopped by the counter and said, in a voice loud enough for the room, "That was not her wall, that was your shortcut." The room went quiet. Rourke looked at Torsten, the same Torsten who had dismissed the panels in October, who had said mild weather proved nothing, who had carried his frost-bitten wife through the storm to Marit's door. "You sold those people a bundle of loose sticks with no clay, no tin, no sorting, and no compression," Torsten said. "You sold it as the same method. It is not the same method. A loaded rifle and a pipe with a bullet in it are not the same thing." Rourke opened his mouth and closed it. Torsten bought his lamp oil and left. The Holst fire became the dividing line. After it, families who wanted panels came to Marit, not to Rourke. They came because the method had rules, and the rules existed for reasons, and the reasons had been tested by a winter that killed a hired hand's fingers and turned a coal hauler's stove into a cracked ruin. Rourke's shortcut had failed publicly, and the failure proved what Marit and Guro had always known. The method was not the materials. The method was the knowledge, the sorting, the compression, the clay, the tin, the gap, the inspection. Remove any piece and the wall became a hazard instead of a shelter. Marit's authority had not been given. It had been built, panel by panel, failure by failure, correction by correction, the way a wall is built, one layer at a time, each one tested before the next is hung. By May, the flood had receded, the damaged stalks had been culled, and new growth was pushing green from the old sunflower roots in the abandoned field. Marit stood in the field one morning with Alma and Clara and Soren Flatten, and 2 women she had not met before the storm, and she showed them how to recognize which stalks from the new growth would be worth cutting after frost, the ones with thick, straight stems and heavy heads that promised dense pith. She was not building panels that morning. She was planting next winter's walls. The wind moved across the prairie the way it always moved, steady, indifferent, testing every surface it crossed. Marit faced it and did not flinch. Behind her, the field stretched south in rows of green, each stalk rising toward a sun that would spend the summer turning dead air into warmth that no wall could hold without help. She had the help now. She had the method. And the people who had called it worthless were standing beside her, learning to see what she had seen in a broken stalk on a cold floor. Not waste, not weeds, but the quiet architecture of still air waiting to be taught its purpose. The summer of 1888 changed the rhythm of Marit's days. She no longer spent her mornings cutting stalks alone in a dead field, while wagons passed without stopping. She spent them in her shed, the lean-to behind the shack that Pater had built for tools, and that now held Guro's windlass above the door, a cutting block worn smooth by hundreds of stalk trimmings, and a sorting rack made of fence posts and baling wire. By June, the shed had become a workshop, and the workshop had visitors. They came on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Not because Marit set a schedule, but because Alma did. Alma had taken the role of organizer without being asked, the way competent women on the prairie took roles, by showing up and doing the work until the work became theirs. She told families which days to come, how many stalks to bring, and what to wear. She told children to stay out of the shed unless they were tying knots. She told men to remove their hats when they entered, not out of respect for Marit, but because hat brims knocked the drying stalks off the racks. The first community project was the schoolhouse. Marit had waited, as Guro had instructed, until summer emptied the building. In July, Torsten and Soren Flatten stripped the plaster from the north and west interior walls, the two that faced the prevailing winter wind, while Marit measured and marked panel positions. The schoolhouse walls were taller than the shack walls by a foot, and the room was 3 times the area. The stove was larger and sat in the center rather than against a wall, which meant the tin shield had to wrap 2 support posts and a section of floor where sparks might land. Hilda Espelon, the schoolteacher, watched Marit work and asked questions that no one else had asked. Not how to build the panels, but why each step mattered. Why alternate the ends? Because uniform thickness traps air evenly. Why clay? Because it delays flame transfer. Why the gap at the floor? Because moisture wicks. Why inspect weekly? Because failure starts small and grows silent. Marit answered each question the way Guro had answered hers, as fact, not instruction. But she noticed something in the exchange that she had not expected. Hilda was not learning to build panels. Hilda was learning to teach the method. She was translating Marit's hand knowledge into words that could be spoken to a room of children, and through those children to families who would never visit Marit's shed. "You are making a lesson," Marit said. "I am making a lesson," Hilda said. "Do you mind?" Marit thought of Guro's hands guiding hers, and her own hands guiding Clara's, and Clara guiding the next person. The chain had been made of touch. Hilda was adding language to it, and language could travel where hands could not. "Teach them the candle test," Marit said. "Every child should know how to find where cold enters." Hilda taught it the following autumn. 23 children held tallow candles to the schoolhouse walls and marked the drafts with chalk. The children who found the most marks won nothing, but they bragged about it for weeks, the way children brag about any skill that makes them feel capable in a world run by adults. The schoolhouse panels performed well through the winter of 1888 into 89. Hilda reported that the stove burned less wood by roughly a third, and the children sitting near the north wall no longer wore coats during lessons. The school board, the same 3 men Guro had warned about, said nothing publicly. But they did not order the panels removed, and the following summer they allowed Marit to line the east wall as well. Marit's operation expanded in 3 directions that first full year. The first was the cabin wall panel, the original design, 6 inches thick, clay-faced, willow-battened, tied every 8 inches. This was the standard, and Marit taught it to every household that asked. By the second winter, 11 families had at least partial coverage. By the third, the number was 23. The second was the window night shutter. This was Marit's own addition, developed after she noticed that the window, even with the feed sack and stalk shutter she had built in October, remained the coldest point in the room. The new design was a 2-inch thick mat of sunflower pith stitched between layers of feed sack cloth, sized to press into the window frame at dusk and remove at dawn. It was lighter than the wall panels, easier to make, and addressed the single greatest heat loss point in most prairie houses. Eli Kavam was the first to request one. She made 3, one for each window, and reported to Torsten that the frost on the inside glass had stopped forming. The third was the schoolhouse corner screen. This was a movable panel, 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, mounted on a wooden base that allowed it to stand freely. Marit designed it for the schoolhouse corners where children sat on benches near the walls, away from the stove's direct heat. The screen stood behind the benches like short walls, blocking the radiant cold from the exterior wall. They could be moved to follow the seating arrangement and stored flat against the wall during summer. Hilda called them warm fences. The children called them Marit shields. Each version required its own rules. The wall panels needed clay wash and tin shielding. The window shutters needed tight stitching to prevent pith from shedding into the room. The corner screens needed weighted bases to prevent tipping and rounded edges to prevent snagging on children's clothing. Marit kept these rules in her head the way Guro had kept hers, not written but tested, each one born from a failure or a near failure that had taught her what not to do. She corrected people without apology. When Torsten's first panel came out loose, she untied it in front of him and retied it at the correct tension. When Alma taught a neighbor to hang panels and the neighbor skipped the clay wash, Marit found out within days and walked to the house to apply the wash herself. When Soren Flatten built a corner screen with raw stalk ends facing the stove, Marit made him sand every end smooth and clay coat them before she would approve the placement. She was not cruel about it. She was specific. "This end will catch in 4 seconds at that distance," she would say, pointing to the raw stalk face. "Clay it or remove it." The specificity was the point. She was not asking for obedience. She was describing physics. Guro had taught her that. Not the physics. Marit had understood trapped air since she was 9 years old in Telemark, but the teaching of it. The refusal to soften a correction because feelings might be bruised. The insistence that the method survive its maker, that the rules exist because the rules work, not because Marit Brecka says so. "Do not let them make you small now that they need you," Guro had said. It was her last lesson, and Marit carried it the way she carried the windlass and the pith-filled mitten as tools that worked. Rourke's final resistance lasted through the summer and into the autumn of 1888. He stopped selling the counterfeit heat mats after the Holst fire, not out of conscience, but because no one would buy them. His store traffic had not declined because he still sold flour, lamp oil, nails, and every other supply the territory needed, but his coal orders had dropped for the first time in 5 years. Families that had lined even one wall with sunflower panels burned less fuel, and families that burned less fuel bought less coal. The arithmetic was not dramatic, a reduction of perhaps 15% across his customer base, but Rourke felt it the way a man feels a crack in a stove, small at first, then widening. He dealt with the loss the way he dealt with everything, by tightening his grip. He raised coal prices by $1 per ton, claiming that the rail depot had increased its rates. He told families who owed him credit that their accounts would come due in full by November, not February, as was customary. He told 2 widows that their claims were poorly improved and offered to buy them at prices that would barely cover the debts they owed him. The territory noticed. Rourke had always been hard, but his hardness had been cushioned by necessity. People needed coal, so they tolerated the man who sold it. Now that the need was slightly less, the tolerance was slightly less. Men who had accepted his terms without complaint began to grumble at the store counter. Women who had nodded at his credit demands began to calculate whether they could survive without his deliveries. Marit did not confront Rourke directly. She did not need to. The panels were the confrontation. Every wall she lined, every shutter she stitched, every corner screen she placed in the schoolhouse was a statement that Rourke's product was not the only path through winter. She was not competing with him. She was making competition possible. The breaking point came in October, when an early frost killed a stand of late wheat and sent temperatures plunging before most families had completed their winter preparations. Rourke owned a sunflower field, a quarter section he had acquired from a bankrupt claim, covered in dead stalks from a crop no one had harvested. The stalks were tall, dry, and dense pithed. They were exactly what the territory needed for panels. Rourke refused to let anyone cut them. He told neighbors the field was his property and the stalks were his to burn or sell, as he saw fit. He would not donate them, and he would not sell them at a price anyone could afford. He posted a notice at the store: "No trespass. Violators prosecuted." The community responded in the way that frontier communities respond when a man hoards what others need, not with violence, but with the silent, implacable withdrawal of cooperation. 3 families who owed Rourke money paid their debts in full and told him they would buy from the depot in Huron directly, even if it meant hauling their own coal. 2 freight drivers who had worked for Rourke took contracts with a new hauler out of Mitchell. The school teacher, Hilda Espeland, wrote a letter to the Huron newspaper describing the sunflower panel method and its results, never mentioning Rourke by name, but making clear that the territory's fuel dependence was a choice, not a fact. The letter ran in November. 12 families from outside the James River Valley wrote to Hilda asking for instruction. Rourke held his position through December. Then an October gale, a late-season wind that came screaming across the flats in the first week of the new year, tore the roof paper from his coal shed and soaked his stored inventory. Wet coal was not ruined forever, but it burned poorly, smoked heavily, and required weeks of dry weather to recover. Rourke's customers, already paying $1 more per ton, were now being offered damp coal at the same premium price. 3 families refused delivery. 5 more sent word that they would wait. Rourke's shed sat full of coal that no one wanted to buy at the price he was asking, and his field sat full of sunflower stalks that everyone wanted to cut and he would not allow. He came to Merritt's workshop on a Tuesday in late January. He came alone. He removed his hat at the door, which Merritt noticed because Rourke had never removed his hat in her presence before. He held the hat in both hands and looked at the windlass above the door and the sorting racks and the stacks of finished panels waiting for the schoolhouse east wall. "I need the tying pattern," he said. Merritt looked at him. This was the man who had offered to buy her dead husband's land for the price of half a grocery bill. The man who had cut off her credit and threatened her neighbor's coal deliveries. The man who had sold dangerous counterfeit panels and blamed her when they caught fire. The man who had locked a field of sunflower stalks behind a trespass notice while families went cold. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of any of it. "Bring a bundle," she said. "A real one, not the loose mats you are selling." Rourke's jaw worked. He went to his wagon, came back with an armload of sunflower stalks cut from his own field, and set them on the workbench. The stalks were unsorted, untrimmed, and roughly handled. The thick ends were all on the same side. The branches had not been stripped. "Untie it," Marit said. "I have not tied it yet." "Then tie it the way you were selling them." Rourke tied the bundle with raw twine, loosely, the way he had tied the heat mats that caught fire in the Holst kitchen. When he was done, Marit lifted the bundle and pressed it. The stalk shifted inside the binding. Air gaps opened along the edges. The surface was uneven, ridged, bristling with branch stubs. "Now untie it," she said, "and start again." He untied it. Marit showed him how to strip the branches, how to sort by diameter, how to alternate the ends, how to use the windlass for even compression, how to tie every 8 inches, how to check the face for gaps by running a flat palm across the surface. She did not teach him the clay wash or the tin shielding. Those would come later, after he had earned them the way she had earned them, one failure at a time. Rourke worked in silence for an hour. His hands were clumsy with the windlass at first, over-tightening the rope until the stalks cracked, then under-tightening until the panels sagged. Marit corrected him the same way she corrected everyone, by pointing to the flaw and describing the consequence. Too tight. The pith crushes and the air cells collapse. The wall loses its purpose. Too loose. The air moves inside the panel. Moving air carries cold. By the time he finished his first proper panel, his knuckles were raw from the rope, and his pride was raw from the corrections. He leaned the panel against the wall and looked at it, pale, even, 6 inches thick, tied tight, butt and head ends alternating. "Worthless weeds," he said. Marit looked at him. His voice was not mocking. It was not angry. It was the voice of a man repeating something he had once believed, hearing for the first time how it sounded now that the belief had been emptied of its certainty. It was a confession, not a joke. She said nothing. She handed him another bundle of unsorted stalks and pointed to the cutting block. He stayed until dusk. Oddman Moen arrived in the spring of 1889, and he arrived the way most things arrived in Marit's life, through work, not intention. He was 59, widowed, a wagon repairer and carpenter by trade, with hands that had shaped more axle hubs and wheel spokes than he could count, and a habit of measuring twice, marking once, and cutting on a line so clean it looked drawn with a pen. He had come to the James River Valley from a Norwegian settlement near Brookings, following a rumor of homestead claims still available for final proof. The rumor was false. The good claims were taken. But by the time he discovered this, he had already repaired 3 wagons, mended a church pew, and built a gate frame for the schoolyard, and the territory had decided he was staying. He heard about the sunflower panels from Torsten, who described them with the precise, grudging admiration of a man who had been wrong about something important and was determined to be right about it from now on. Torsten told Oddman that the panels worked, that the method was specific, and that the woman who had built them did not tolerate loose work. Oddman came to the shed on a Saturday. He did not ask about panels. He asked about the windlass. "The rope stretches," he said, examining the braided cord that Guro had brought on the first morning. "After 50 compressions, the tension drops. You're retying the same panels because the binding loosens as the rope fatigues." Marit stared at him. He was right. She had noticed the same problem, but had attributed it to her own inconsistency, not to the tool. The windlass rope had been replaced twice since Guro brought it, each time with a slightly different braid, and each time the tension had been slightly different. "What would you use instead?" she asked. Oddman did not answer immediately. He went to his wagon, came back with a planed oak board, a wooden screw, and a wing nut he had forged himself. Within an hour, he had built a compression frame, 2 boards connected by the screw, tightened by the wing nut, applying even, repeatable pressure across the full width of the panel. The pressure could be set by counting turns of the nut: 5 turns for a wall panel, 3 for a window shutter, 7 for a corner screen base. Marit tested the frame on a new panel. The compression was uniform. The surface came out flat without the ridges that still appeared at the edges of windlass compressed panels. The binding held tighter because the pressure did not fluctuate while she tied. She looked at Oddman. "You have improved the method." "I have improved the tool," he said. "The method was already correct." It was the right thing to say, and he knew it was the right thing to say, and Marit knew he knew, and the knowledge of that shared awareness, his respect for her work, stated without flattery, was the first thread of something she had not expected to feel again after Pater's death. Their courtship happened the way frontier courtships happened, when both people were old enough to have buried a spouse and young enough to want company that was not grief. It happened through work. Oddman built compression frames. Marit tested them and rejected any that splintered, warped, or applied uneven pressure. He learned to ask before he improved, because the first time he modified a panel dimension without consulting her, she pulled the panel apart and rebuilt it at the original size, and the silence between them lasted 2 days. He learned. She let him. By the second winter, Oddman had moved his workbench into Marit's shed. Not into her house, into the shed. The bench sat opposite the sorting racks, and the sound of his playing on willow battens mixed with the sound of her tying knots on panels, and the two sounds together became the rhythm of a partnership that was not romance in the way a young person might imagine romance, but was something sturdier. The mutual recognition that two people working in the same room toward the same purpose, with respect for each other's skill, had built something that neither could build alone. He moved into the house the following spring. They married in the autumn of 1891, after Dakota statehood had turned the territory into 2 states, and the county records required new paperwork. The ceremony was plain, a circuit preacher, Torsten, and Eli as witnesses, Alma and Clara bringing a cake made with the last of the summer's sugar. Marit wore a dress she had sewn herself, with buttons made from sunflower stalk slices, sanded smooth and lacquered with stove blacking. Oddmund wore a clean shirt and his only tie, which was the same tie he had worn to his first wife's funeral, and which Marit did not ask about because some things are carried without explanation. They added a sod bank pantry to the shack the following year. They hosted winter work days where families brought stalks and tools and left with panels and knowledge. They never charged for instruction. Marit kept a ledger, not of money owed, but of houses improved, panel count, stove distance measurements verified, and inspection dates. The ledger was not a record of commerce. It was a record of safety. The years compressed. 1892. The church loft was lined with emergency mats that could be carried to any home in crisis. 1893. Clara Satter, now 15, taught a group of younger children to tie the square knot used in panel binding, and the children competed to see who could tie the fastest and tightest. 1894. Torsten, now 69, told a family of new arrivals from Minnesota. Ask Widow Brecka before you hang anything near a stove, using the name she had carried before her second marriage, because that was the name the method carried, and names, like walls, hold what is placed inside them. The language of the territory changed. Weeds became wall stalks. The flower house became the Brecka method. Children no longer chanted mockery near the well. They collected straight sunflower stems from the autumn fields and bragged to each other about who had found the longest, the thickest, the one with pith so dense it would not crush between 2 fingers. The thing that had been worthless had become ordinary, and ordinary was the highest form of acceptance the prairie offered. Marit never became wealthy. She never sold panels for profit. She never traveled to Huron to speak to the newspaper, though Hilda Espelon's letters had brought inquiries from as far as Yankton and Pierre. She remained on the claim, Pater's claim, now hers and Oddman's, and she kept Guro's windlass above the shed door even after Oddman's compression frames had replaced it entirely, because the windlass was not a tool anymore. It was a name. It was a hand on her shoulder in the cold. 23 households learned the method over 3 winters. The schoolhouse stayed warm. The church stored emergency panels. Families saved stalks the way they saved seed wheat, not all at once, not carelessly, but with the knowledge that what you keep through the summer determines what survives the winter. Marit and Oddman grew old on the claim. He planed battens until his hands could no longer grip the plane, and then he sharpened tools for men who could. She tied panels until her fingers swelled at the joints, and then she supervised while others tied, pointing to flaws with a stick because her hands could not demonstrate what her eyes still saw. They never had children together. They had the territory's children who learned to find drafts with candle flame, who knew that still air holds warmth, who understood that a wall is not a wall until it has been tested. Odman died in 1904, in the chair beside the stove, with a half-planed batten across his knees and a pencil behind his ear. Marit hung the batten on the wall next to the windlass and did not plane it smooth. The roughness was his signature, interrupted. She lived 4 more years. In the last autumn of her life, Judd Rourke, older, slower, his store now run by a nephew who lacked his uncle's appetite for leverage, brought a bundle of sunflower stalks to Marit's shed. He carried them under one arm, the way he had carried them on the January day he first asked for the tying pattern. His hat was in his hand again. He set the bundle on the workbench and looked at the windlass above the door and the compression frames lined up against the wall and the ledger on the shelf, thick with pages, each one a house, a wall, a name. "Worthless weeds," he said. His voice was soft. The words were the same, but the man who said them was not the man who had said them on a frozen road 15 years ago. The mockery was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was the sound of a man who had spent 15 years watching a word change its meaning and had finally heard himself say it the way the word had always wanted to be said, as wonder, not dismissal. Marit looked at his bundle. The stalks were sorted by diameter. The ends were trimmed. The branches were stripped. "You remembered," she said. "I remembered." She showed him the compression frame's new wing nut, a brass one Odmund had made the year before he died, smoother than the iron original. Rourke turned it 5 times, counted, and pressed the panel flat. Within 5 winters, more than 24 homes around the James River Valley used some version of Marit Brecke's sunflower panels, window shutters, or schoolhouse screens. The method did not replace fuel. It changed how fuel was spent. One ledger page near the back, in Hilda Espelon's careful handwriting, listed the spread: Satter House, Kavam House, Schoolhouse North and West and East Walls, Moan Workshop, Church Loft, 2 bachelor shacks, 3 widow cabins, the Flatten Claim, the Tavite Rebuild, and 9 others whose names filled the margins like seedlings crowding a row. Marit died in 1908, in the spring, after a short illness that took her the way the prairie took everything it wanted, quickly, without negotiation. She was buried beside Pater on the claim, on the rise above the shack, where the wind came from the northwest and the sunflower field was visible to the south. She kept Guro's rope windlass above the shed door until the end. She kept Pater's coat, patched so many times the original cloth was a rumor beneath layers of mending, on the nail beside the stove. Under the eaves, on the morning they found her, sunflower stalks stood drying upright in the April air, bound for another family's wall. On the night of January 11th, 1888, ice sealed every surface on the Dakota prairie. Wind drove snow across the Glaze until the world disappeared. A hired man lost 3 fingers walking 15 steps from a door. A coal hauler's stove cracked because the walls around it could not hold the heat he poured in. A mother carried a coughing child through the dark to the only warm room for miles, a 12 by 14 shack lined with dead sunflower stalks tied between willow slats. "Leave the weeds for the stove," a man on the road had said, watching Marit Brecke drag a frozen bundle through the ruts while 3 wagons passed without stopping. She did not leave them. She did not burn them. She pressed them flat, sealed them with clay, hung them 1 inch above the floor, and built a room where the heat did not flee. Years later, the men who had laughed stood in her yard, tying dead stalks into panels under her direction, their hands raw with the same rope burns she had earned alone. On that prairie, the thing they called worthless was not the sunflower. It was the heat they had been letting go,